topic today is Genesis 22, the story of the binding of Isaac. And I know that this has perplexed and troubled people over the centuries. And you know, we come to shul on Rosh Hashanah, as some of us, I think, you know, sort of expecting some confrontation with the text. I should mention, you know, maybe in memory of a very prominent and professor and good friend, Bert Raven, passed away just last year. So Bert was a social psychologist, and he actually took this very personally. He thought that reading this passage set it up as a model to be that we should aspire to of devotion, and as a sort of central teaching of Judaism. He saw it as not only negative, but potentially generating really bad consequences. And there are incidents, you know, we know of this type of devotion that gets out of hand when people are willing to sacrifice themselves and others for God. So we need to keep that in mind. I'll come back to it later on. But I'd like to begin with a midrash that's a favorite of mine. It's based on a verse in Psalm 19, Torat Adonai Temimah Mishivat Nafesh. The Torah of God is perfect. It restores the soul. So the midrash, it appears in a number of places, but it's most explicit it's articulated best in Yalkut Shimoni, which is a late midrash, where it says as follows. If I can find the line here. Here. Torat Hashem Temimah, Rabbi Yirmiyah v'Rabbanan. So Rabbi Yirmiyah and the majority of rabbis, the other rabbis, disagreed. They don't tell us which one had which opinion, but Chad Minhon Amar, one of them said, Lama hi Temimah. Why is the law of God, the Torah of God, perfect? Why? Because it restores the soul. The other opinion was, why does the Torah restore the soul? Because it's perfect. So the difference of opinion between these two, these arguing sides, is one holds what we now call a divine command ethics, which is that when God commands something, it is by definition the right thing. No question can be raised. It's absolutely correct to be followed and moral, right? It's the ethical way. And the other opinion is what we call today natural law ethics, that the ethics of behavior are to be determined on the basis of what we consider to be the moral standard of our time. Or perhaps, you know, if we natural law, what is in accord with the principles of natural law. So this is an argument about perspective. Do we look at morality from the perspective of the divine or from the human perspective? And it's a central issue. How does religion fit into this? How do we engage in this conversation? Do we impose the divine standard, or do we recognize the need for the human standard to somehow be in accord with what religion demands? It's an old question, an old debate, and it emerges here in the context of the Akedah, and it's made even more severe because we have some precedent with regard to Abraham, and that's a problem. What am I talking about when I say precedent with regard to Abraham? Anybody have an idea what I mean? You can unmute yourself and just shout out if you.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
That's correct. Exactly. In other words, you have stone, and Abraham argued with God to save the Sodomites. He can't bring himself to argue on behalf of his own son. Now, of course, you know, the tradition turns that around. That's just an indication of his extreme devotion. He's willing to argue for others, but not for his own son. Of course, I think some of us would say there's something inhuman about this capacity to be so loving of others and not loving of one's own. I mean, it's not a standard that I think we can uphold. All right, so let me just mention that this question of what attitude we have towards the Akedah is confronted during different periods of Jewish history, and there are times in Jewish history, not many, thank God, where the Akedah becomes a model that's affirmed and that's embraced. And you're familiar with some of them. One of them is Hannah and her 7 sons. So there in the Maccabean period, you do find a mention. By the way, if I remember correctly, and people can check me out, the Akedah is not mentioned anywhere else in the Bible. You would imagine that such a central act where Abraham gives evidence to his total devotion and faith, which then garners for him and his descendants the protection of God, would be mentioned again and again as an example, as evidence. It's not mentioned. It's not used, right? There's an argument with God. You owe us something at all, right? Never used. It is mentioned in the Hasmonean period as a justification for suicide and for martyrdom. Now, once again, it reappears in a very blatant way during the Crusades, because during the Crusades, we actually have poetry where rabbis are writing afterwards that we acted like Abraham, but Abraham only sacrificed one son. We sacrificed all of our children. We killed each other. He shouldn't fall into the hands of the marauding Christians. There is even one text, when I think about, to me, one of the most troubling of texts, that's a theme of Shalom Spiegel's very important book that I recommend, called The Last Trial, where Shalom Spiegel has a medieval poem which celebrates the actual sacrifice of Isaac. I'll read you the translation here. It's a long poem about the Akedah, and there he writes, Ephraim Bon is the author. He made haste, that's Abraham. He pinned him down with his knees, right, Abraham. He made his 2 arms strong. With steady hands, he slaughtered him according to the rite. That means Abraham followed the laws of ritual slaughter. Full right was the slaughter. Then the next line is fascinating. Down upon him fell the resurrecting dew, and he revived. So not only was Isaac slaughtered, but Isaac was resurrected. Now this is the Crusades, so you're clearly writing under Christian influence. And in a way, the Jews are out, besting the Christians, in terms of showing them their devotion. The poem continues. I mean, it's fascinating and troubling. The father sees him then to slaughter him once more. Abraham didn't give up. He knew that God had commanded him to sacrifice his son, and he wanted to fulfill the commandment. All right? Scripture bears witness. Well-grounded is the fact, and the Lord called Abraham even a second time from heaven. So God, in a way, with the way Ephraim Laban is interpreting the Akedah, it doesn't work out necessarily in the text, but he claims that God had to call Abraham a second time in order to prevent him from going ahead with the slaughter after Isaac had been resurrected. Abraham was so committed to this slaughter. Right. So those are sort of historically determined interpretations and settings that sort of push the Akedah to the forefront, given the Jewish experience. But for a generation that knows of, including having survivors who survived the Holocaust, I think that it's very hard for us to talk about, martyrdom as an act of faith in God and something that God has commanded. There's something perverse about that, it seems to be. So, but nevertheless, there are contemporary thinkers who affirm the Akedah as a model. So I wanted to first begin with that before we depart to the critique and I'm going to have to share with you. I want to share with you our text, which many of you have. All right, everybody have that. This is the text, and I'll go through this line by line as we study. And please feel free to raise some questions if you have any. I want to finish this section and then about affirmation of the Akedah. So before I talk about Soloveitchik, I want to talk about Yeshayahu Leibowitz. Now, Yeshayahu Leibowitz is a complicated figure. He died a few years ago, maybe more than a few years ago. He was a contemporary Israeli professor of chemistry and physics. And when he retired from the departments of chemistry and physics, he taught philosophy, Kant and Maimonides. And he was a gadfly. He spoke out politically. He spoke out again. He called the Kotel the discotel. He said some rather harsh things about Israeli soldiers, so harsh that when he was awarded the Israel Prize, the prize was withdrawn. But he got the last laugh because he withdrew from the prize before they had a chance to withdraw the prize from him. He was a character, an important character, and someone who tried to struggle with the idea of what it means for the Jews to have a state and to have power, and how that affects our character and our sense of self and Judaism. He was, in many ways, there was a type of religious absolutism that sounds almost fundamentalist in his devotion. His notion is that the way in which we demonstrate our faith is through pure commitment and submission. Doesn't sound like Judaism, but if there's a mitzvah, we have to do it. If we try to create Judaically, then we need to understand that type of creativity, spiritual, religious creativity, is self-serving. The way to devote oneself to God is to do what God asks, not to do what we like. Religion isn't about what we like and what satisfies us. Religion is what satisfies God. Now, some of you may be laughing cynically and saying, yeah, that's what we thought religion was all the time. Anyway, that's why, why should we have anything to do with religion? Right? But he's an outlier. He's an outlier even in, I would say, in the Orthodox community. But, he didn't hang, he was an Orthodox Jew. The people who were his students were generally liberal left people who liked his politics and his religious interpretations. He was outrageous in his capacity to be creative. And by the way, he contributed a lot. He edited the Encyclopedia Ivrit. It's, I think, 26 volumes. He was a single editor of the editor-in-chief of the enterprise. So he contributed a lot to Israeli culture, and he was an active participant in Israeli political society and intellectual world and culture all his life. And you could go to his house at any time. He was willing to talk to anybody, right? So in writing about the Akedah, I want to read a few lines. He says as follows. He says that Abraham could have actually responded to God, and he says not only from the perspective of righteousness, even from the perspective of truth. Abraham had an opportunity, an opening to say to God. I just quote God to God. Yesterday, that through Isaac you will have generations. And now you tell me to slaughter him? You yourself said that my progeny, my legacy is through Isaac. And he didn't say a word. In other words, Abraham was silent. That was the silence. The sort of irony in the title here is, I called the silence of the lamb. It wasn't the lamb that was silent. Actually, Isaac did speak up for a moment, right? It was Abraham who brought the slaughter, the sacrifice, who was silent. Shtikato shel Abraham, all right? There's a parenthesis, mi'ida she'emunato eina emuna al t'nai. Abraham's silence is an attestation, evidence, an attestation to the fact that his faith is not a conditional faith. That's so, strong, and his faith is not defined by the categories of human morality. So, does religious devotion require extra human commitment beyond the moral boundaries of our generally considered humanity? Now, that's a position that Leibovich articulated, for which there is support both in the tradition and from people outside who understand. That's how they understand the passage. It's close. It's Kierkegaardian, who saw the binding of Isaac. What do you call that? As the theological suspension of the ethical. Right? I think that's the phrase that he uses. I may be wrong. Right? So that's Leibovich. Now, Soloveitchik, I think, has a bit more of a moderate understanding, although he too affirms the Akedah in the following way. So you can follow here. He writes as follows: build an altar, arrange the pieces of wood, kindle the fire, take the knife to slaughter your existence for my sake. Thus commands the awesome God, who suddenly appears from absolute seclusion. This approach is the basis of prayer. Man surrenders himself to God, he approaches the awesome God, and the approach expresses itself in the sacrifice and Akedah of oneself. So I would say that Soloveitchik tries to use the Akedah creatively. He wants to move away from the actual notion of slaughter, and even from the absoluteness of Leibovich's suspension of human morality, to a point where the Akedah serves as a model for self-negation, a type of afsiyut. In Chassidut, you have this idea that in order to approach God, we first have to empty ourselves out. Because if we're filled with ourselves, there's no room for God. Let me add a corollary to that. If we're filled with ourselves, there's no room for others. So there's a moral dimension to standing in front of God and emptying oneself. I become nothing in order to provide myself with the ability to engage with others. And in my engagement with others, I become something. It's not that I lose myself completely, although there is that potential religiously to exhaust oneself. And at that point, you're no longer alive. You can exhaust yourself in the pursuit, and you can become heavenly, and you lose your human capacity. You lose it. That's how we say, you lose it. That's what the rabbis are worried about with people who become too holy. They lose their humanity, and they want to hold people down. That's the role of the halakha. Jewish law, the role of halakha is to hold religious zeal and religious passion, and to provide for some sobriety, so that the passion and zeal don't get out of hand. Now, maybe I'll stop here because I want to move on. But I wanted you to see that we do have this tradition. We have a theological tradition that celebrates the subordination of one's will, total obedience. That's what's called for. The goal, the model of faith is total obedience without a challenge. Silence in the face of God's demand. Any questions about this? Okay. All right.
The submission and non-questioning sounds very much like Islam.
No, that's what I meant before. That it doesn't sound like Judaism. But let me just say something about that. If someone has their speaker on, I'll open. When one of the things that you learn both, when you immerse yourself in your tradition and when you engage with other religious traditions, is that there's a certain amount of prejudice that goes in each religious tradition in the attempt to teach it in a way that it's different and unique. And in doing so, the commonalities are usually elided, and we lose a sense that that might be a Jewish idea. We see it very much in Christianity, that Christian notions of sort of to witness. That's a biblical idea. That's a Jewish idea. But if you say, if a Jew talks about witnessing, it doesn't sound Jewish any longer. So Norm is right in that submission is a value, is a supreme value in Islam. Right? So I think the point of Leibovich is to say, it's a supreme value in Judaism as well. That's why I called it the Sulam Bunim. It's the highest good in Jewish religiosity. What is distinct, however, is that he's not the majority. He's not the majority, number one, and his formulation of this idea of total submission is on the extreme side within the Jewish sphere. But you're right, we share that. We're a religion. That's the point. Religions all exhibit these tendencies. The questions are more subtle in terms of the distinctions. How do religions distinguish themselves? What do they choose to emphasize, and what do they choose to scuttle? As a central ingredient. Okay, so your point well taken. All right, let's move on. What is distinctive?
Chaim?
Yes, please.
Suzanne wanted to ask a question.
Suzanne, go ahead. I don't see her. All right, please.
No, I'm fine, thanks.
Okay.
Different Suzanne.
Oh, different Suzanne, sorry.
You muted yourself. Hold on. We can't hear you right now, Suzanne. There you are.
Is that a parallel way to understand Job?
Is that a parallel way to understand Job? Job, no. Job, I think you can try to construct a comparison in his refusal to argue, seemingly refusal to argue. But it seems to me that in the end, what we learn from Job is a certain amount of personal defiance. That's I'm actually reporting to you the reading of the last translation that just appeared a couple months ago by Ed Greenstein that I have started to study. So I have to admit to you, I've always had trouble with Job. And one of the ways I dealt with having trouble with Job is I avoided really dealing with it in depth over the years. And I didn't like the guy, I didn't like his friends much. But Greenstein has really brought the book to life in his new translation. I think it's published by Princeton, if I'm not mistaken. You should look for it online. And he really pushes strongly the notion of a defiance in Job, and that his reaction and his holding on to principle was in fact his way of demonstrating, that he's not going to succumb in the ways in which they wanted him to succumb. They wanted him to succumb to the tradition being that obviously he did something wrong. He would never succumb to that. So there's a certain heroism, it seems to me, in the way in which Greenstein presents Job. So I would say that it's something different from Abraham, and know that Abraham was willing to kill his son. Job didn't do anything to anybody. I mean, I think it's very different. It's a question of how he accepts his fate. Yes, but he didn't act in a way that would question his morality. I mean, except that's what his friends wanted him to think, that somehow he had violated. But all right. So
in your last lesson, didn't you say that the greatness is at the end, after the outcome?
The outcome.
And the outcome is a defiance.
Yes. Okay. So we'll get to that. Okay. We'll get to that here as well. Thank you. That's very good. Thank you.
Chaim, can I give you one more question? You can save it or not.
Well, let's take one more and then we'll move on.
Okay, the question is this a method of self-improvement?
I don't know, what's the improvement? That's what I don't understand. By submitting and
Right,
submitting one's will.
right.
I think that, again, I'm not a moral philosopher, but I think that there's a difference between humility and total self-sacrifice. And that, there's something here that I say that's perverted. Leibovitz might agree with you. Let me put it this way. The self-improvement is that in order for a child to be able to achieve a degree of independence, the father has to know that he's no longer in control of the child's life. So Abraham went out on a picnic with Isaac to demonstrate to him that he's willing to let go of his dominance by sacrificing his control over his son. And then God, of course, redeems this act. So Abraham emerges renewed. The problem with that, of course, is that after this passage, I don't think we have any evidence of Abraham and Isaac speaking to one another again. It doesn't, the relationship doesn't seem to thrive after this encounter. And we don't have any evidence, by the way, of, although Abraham, we have midrashim about Abraham's pursuing Ishmael. There was something was broken in the Abrahamic house. That's what I think is so interesting about our tradition. Abraham is our hero in a way. I mean, he's the founder. He brought God into the world, but his household is broken and troubled. The tension between Sarah and Hagar, the expulsion of both of Ishmael, and then the sacrifice of Isaac. He was heroic in his capacity to reach others. In his own household, there wasn't peace. There's something about that we need to sort of struggle with. I don't have answers for you on that, but we got to carry that. All right. The next series of sources present a critique that emerges from within the tradition. It's so interesting to me. In a way, if this is what we learn today, I think it would be worthwhile because we're not familiar with it. I'll tell you the context, and then we'll see the various ways in which it's presented. There are, basically two themes, right? So the question is, if Abraham is God's designated one, he's the one who brought God into the world. He is the monotheist par excellence, right? So, by the way, just to back up for a moment, one of Leibovich's questions is that, why is Abraham so important? The whole world that he lived in, the Melchizedek world, Avimelech world, all these kings, they believed in some higher God. I mean, they weren't Jews, but neither was Abraham a Jew. There was a sense of monotheism in the air. So Abraham's faith was not unusual. By what did he distinguish himself? So that's why Leibovich has to come to the point that he distinguished himself not in his understanding of a relationship to one God. Others had that, or one supreme God. It's because of his because of his yirah, his awesome commitment, his awesome love of this God, which was total commitment, which made him different from all the other God adherents in his time. So, if so, the later medieval poets start asking the question, and that is, if Abraham is such a big deal, and he had a relationship with God, and he brought God into the world and taught others, why didn't God reveal the Torah to Abraham? Why did God wait for Moses? That would have been great to start in Genesis. And, maybe we wouldn't have had to go to Egypt. I mean, the whole story would have been different if Abraham had the Torah. So what they do is they have to find a flaw in Abraham's behavior that precluded his being the recipient or the transmitter of the Torah. Now, there's something so interesting about that on a number of levels. Number one, there's a recognition. We think that Abraham is high up. He had ultimate faith. Yeah, but they say, yeah, he was high up, but he didn't get the Torah, and we have the Torah. They didn't get it. And yet that's Abraham, the founder. The founder didn't have it, and we have it. And that's the great gift that God gave to the world, and he lacked it. And the second thing is that there's not only an admission, there's a pursuit here of attributing failure and a flaw to the founder. That is central, it seems to me, to the Jewish reading of Scripture, that our heroes need to be somehow, they have to have some, what do you call that, a yoke that they carry with them, that they bear in life, every one of them. In fact, there's a famous Gemara about, why King David succeeded and Saul didn't succeed. Saul was too perfect. David carried an open a book of accusation, indictment. His act with Bathsheba, his behavior, general behavior, and that kept him in check. Right? Our principal leaders need to know who they are. They're humans. They're not saints. And we need to know that they're humans and not saints. Wow, that's redemptive. That's why we have such an active tradition, and a tradition that confronts rather than merely submits in that way. Okay, so the first passage, now all these poems, not all of them, out of their four little excerpts, three of the excerpts come from the poetry of the Shavuot morning service. Because Shavuot is a celebration of the giving of the Torah. So the first one was written by Kalir. He was our earliest composer of liturgical poetry, what we call piyutim. And his poetry makes up a big chunk of the Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur service. He lived in the 6th century, so he's very early. And the Kalir meshed into his poetry midrashic interpretations. So if Kalir says it, it's not just his idea, it's something that was in the air. So this is what he writes. The faithful one answered to the Lord to praise him and exalt him, the faithful one being Abraham. The young man with whom you graced him when his strength was spent, that means when Abraham was older, he bound on the wood of the altar, as God had, as in fulfillment of the commandment. Arrested for 3 days, arrested for 3 days means, it took them 3 days to get up the mountain. So it means, they had 3 days to work on this. Arrested for 3 days, it's going to come up again. He offered his chick. It was pleasant, and his offering was accepted. All right, so basically, Kalir says that by merely bringing him to the altar, that was the fulfillment of God's command. It didn't require that he actually had to slaughter him. I mean, right? That's how he wants to play it. It was pleasant. It's like a pleasant offering. As you would find that phrase in the Torah. Nichoach, those who read Hebrew see that word that appears in the Torah often. He became great. That's Abraham. And his reputation spread throughout the land. Right? So, whoa, he's the man who should get the Torah. Because if he got the Torah, not only will the Jews have the Torah, right? Maybe the children of Abraham would have the Torah. That means the truth would be, or the true religion would be spread beyond merely Abraham's descendants, right? Abraham's biological descendants. So, but Kalir says, but he forgot how a father is supposed to have mercy on his son. A prayer or plea he should have offered. Now I know, you said to him, to praise him, the one who made the land with his strength. So Kalir, I think, is not satisfied with merely criticizing Abraham. He throws in a line about God. God said, now I know how devoted you are. What do you mean now you know how devoted he is? He didn't defend his son. And you can't give him the Torah. By the way, the indictment comes from the Torah. The Torah says, I cannot be transmitted to Abraham. The Torah pre-exists creation, right, in the theological world. And the Torah makes its choice not to be transmitted through Abraham. Similarly, turn the page. I think these piyutim are fascinating. Now here we only have on the left-hand side a partial translation that I found. I'll read and translate the lines to you. Anta Amon, let me get to it. I'm sorry. Anta Amon. So Amon is the Torah. Kli Amunato, God's artistic tool. God's tool is the Torah. Ladar, Anta Amon Ladar B'Momim. The Torah responded to the one who dwells in the heights, to God. Yadati Gamani, Ki Hu Tov V'Holech Tamim. I also know that he's a good guy, and he walks in perfection. Aval al Yechido, Lo Kana Rachamim. But for his one and only Isaac, he didn't acquire, he didn't demand mercy. V'shalach yad ke'achzar l'shpoch damim. And he set forth his hand brutally to spill his blood. V'kol kach la'asot utoncha, and all of this in order to fulfill your will with a pure heart. Uvatuach haya ki ata malei rachamim. It's true. He had the faith that in the end you would come through because he knew you were full of mercy. But nevertheless, haya lo lehitchanein lefanecha. He should have petitioned you. Ulevakesh rachamim. V'lachsoch chido me'esh pechamim. And to hold back his child, his one and only child, Isaac, from the fire of the coals. V'hu lo chas v'chasta malei rachamim. He didn't have rachmanos, compassion. You had compassion. You're filled with compassion. V'hu lo richem. He did not. He had no rachmanos. V'hu richamta ba'al harachamim. If you would not have had compassion and mercy, the master of mercy, then Isaac wouldn't have been saved. All right, so that's the piyut of a 7th century Palestine. But by the way, Kalir and Rabbi Yochanan HaKohen both live in Palestine. So they're living during the time where the Midrash is being written. So they're obviously drawing on themes that rabbis had been discussing. And they themselves put these themes to poetry. And the poetry, by the way, it's in the prayer book. So it's no one hid it. No one kept it as a hidden treasure. The poem of Ephraim of Bon after the Crusades, that didn't enter into the liturgy. But these entered into the liturgy. It means it was open and evident to all. So the critique of Abraham and the critique of the Akedah was something available to people who understood what they were saying in prayers. Now, Rabbi Yosef Tovelim was a French scholar, a medieval French scholar, and his poem was published or appeared in Mainz in Germany, but the culture was joint, French-German culture. It was Rashi's culture in the 11th century. And he also contributes, and he says as follows. It's interesting. We have a partial translation of the last 2 lines. There was found a defect, a little defect in his behavior. You tried him, you tested him with his only one, with his unique son, Ahuv, the one who is beloved, ba'olalav, of his children. Nachatz lahashiv matan levalav. He rushed to return the gift to its master, to God. Ne'epach la'achzari. He was transformed into a brutal, cruel man, vayimrod kelav, and he sharpened his knife. I mean, I love the imagery. He restrained himself. He refrained from appealing to God and to carry forward, to uplift his prayers. Nofet sufai efrosh mimulav. Nofesh sufai is a beautiful phrase. The honeycombs flow. I will distance from him. The honeycombs flow is the Torah. The Torah that flows with beauty, interpretation, and love, that will not be transmitted through Abraham. That's the judgment. And then the last one on Rosh Hashanah, which is not related to the Akedah, but nevertheless related to Abraham and has something, I think has something to say to us, and that is, it describes Abraham. It tells us as follows. He made the straight path known to those who were perverse. Right? He taught the world about God. There wasn't a place that he went without leading some sort of open discussion and conversation, and he had all the talking points, and his tent was open at all times, and he was trying to welcome people into this faith community. that it was opened up to the world. Yet because he questions God's gift of land, saying, how shall I know? His descendants were sentenced to the hard line of slavery. I don't completely agree with the translation. You shall know they will be strangers. So this is a pun, and it's a very direct play, actually. Abraham had the chutzpah, says Kalir in this poem, to ask God, how do I know that I'm going to inherit the land that you just promised me? So in sort of response for Abraham saying, how do I know? God made a promise to him. And this is why I'm bringing this, because it's always puzzled me. The promise was at the covenant of the pieces. God tells Abraham, you should know that your descendants are going to be strangers in a land not their own. And then there will be slaves, etc., etc., etc. And then I will redeem them. So it always bothered me. What did we do to merit such a reward, such a promise, that we're going to be strangers in the land? In other words, we just begin our history. Abraham, it's not even our history, it's our prehistory. There's no Hebrew people yet. There's only a family, Abraham. And how come Abraham gets this promise, it's called, the promise, that you're going to be a stranger in the land, and you're going to suffer for hundreds of years, and you're going to be slaves in that land, and then I'm going to redeem you. What was the reason for that? So although I don't know whether there's, you can see this as being just, the play is significant. The doubting of Abraham in challenging this way, how do I know? In other words, God was making a promise to him. And Abraham saying, I need some proof that I should, really follow you. Give me some proof, in a way. That's what it sounds a little bit. I think something crude about the question that Abraham asked. How do I know? And so God said, how do you know? Yado Akedah, you will know, because you'll see what's going to happen to you. All right. So I don't like. I must say that I have resisted. I don't like to look at it as a punishment. I see it as our destiny. In other words, we went into exile in Egypt in order to be able to construct. We're going to talk about this when we talk about Sukkot, so I'm not going to jump the gun. But in order to construct our identity, our basic identity as a people, so it was basic training for our sense of who we are. Nevertheless, what I wanted to demonstrate is that there's a tradition in the Midrashim of linking the Akedah to a flaw in Abraham's character, and also to find other flaws in Abraham's behavior, even though he was described as being perfect, right? Walk before me, tamim, and be perfect or nearing perfection. Nevertheless, he too was a human being, and he too veered. He veered in some way, and in his devotion, he was overly zealous. Let me say another word about this and move on. When I thought about this, so the question came to mind. So Abraham didn't merit the Torah, but Moses merited the Torah. What was the difference between Moses and Abraham? So now, and also the question that we asked at the beginning, how come Abraham had the guts and the drive to challenge God regarding stone? The answer is, I think, as follows, that in Sodom, what he demanded was justice. Abraham knew the attribute of Elohim. He knew about justice, and he knew that God was just, and that's what he presented to the world. He didn't know this notion of relationship and compassion and caring. That's the Yud He Vav He, the Tetragrammaton. And that's how in Exodus it says, Ushmi Hashem lo noda lahem. My name of my Tetragrammaton name, my Yud He Vav He name, I didn't proclaim to the patriarchs, meaning they didn't understand that dimension of my being, that's an essential part of my being, and that I'm not just, and what you're bringing to the people is not just the notion of a just God, but a God who cares. And when Moses was confronted by God who wanted to destroy the Jewish people, Moses' first response was, "Mecheni na misifracha." I don't want any part of it. Wipe me out of your book. Don't tell me that I'll continue the line. I don't want to survive if you're going to destroy the people. I don't want your justice. I demand your rachmanos. So Moses's leadership, Moses's unique leadership, was founded on his capacity to push God, to express his rachmanut, and that's what we lean on Yom Kippur, to move God from the throne of justice to the throne of compassion and mercy. That's the transformation that occurs. The idea being that we have to look for that inside ourselves. Justice isn't the way that the world's going to survive. It can't be so clean and clear. It has to be mitigated. It has to be refined, right? By a sense of mercy and compassion. That's why the second chapter of Genesis adds the name Yud Hey Vav Hey in the creation story, because the world couldn't survive if it only had the attribute of justice. Now, I'm not, I haven't worked this out completely, but it did strike me as being one of the distinctive characteristics that it's between Abraham and Moses. Okay, we got to move on. So I'm going to move on more quickly at this point. Why was Abraham silent? Right, Midrashic reflection. So the Midrash basically tries to tell us, not so clear that Abraham was silent. Look at this Midrash. Abraham's climbing the mountain. Samael came to our father Abraham. So this is Satan. So we have a Satan in the Midrash, or Satan, although featured more prominently in Job, but here Satan in the Midrash came to our father Abraham. Now, who is Satan? Why is it Satan? Why? Because he says, "Old man, have you lost your mind?" It's wonderful. It's a wonderful Midrash, because basically it says what we want to say. What's wrong with Abraham? So the Midrash, by putting this in Satan, makes it kosher, right? Because the Midrash can't say, the Midrash doesn't come out right and say Abraham's immoral. That's not the language of the rabbis. What the rabbis do is, in an underhanded way, it's a subversive way. They put the critique in the mouth of Satan so that we can hear it. And we say, yeah, that's right. And in fact, the impression is that this resistance that Abraham has is a satanic resistance. Yes, it's a satanic resistance, but this satanic resistance happens to be right on. It's the right impulse. Listen to what this satanic impulse forces him to say. It says to him, "Will you slaughter the son given to you when you were 100 years old?" So Abraham says, so you have Abraham being very pious. Yes, justice. Yeah, exactly. That's it. God wants me to do it. I'm ready to do it. So Satan says, he said to him, "If he tests you with something even harder, will you be able to stand it? If someone tries something with you, will you be impatient?" All right, Job, quoting from Job, and Abraham says to Satan, "Yes, of course, yes, more than this. I'm ready to go all the way." He said to him, "Tomorrow," and this is the coup de grace, "tomorrow you will be considered a murderer, and you will be guilty." He said to him, "Yes, justice." So the Satan goes all the way with his accusation, and that's the accusation that we bring to this passage. Satan mouths what we want to say. Did God want Abraham to murder? And is murder a religious value in the name of God? Right? And Satan here is the one who knows it's not. That's what's perverted about this. Satan happens to know what's moral. Abraham, the man of faith, doesn't know what's moral, at least the way in this upside down presentation. And we have also in our prayer service a line that should give us pause and make us think about what we've been saying all these years. And we say this in Slichot, and in the Mishnah it appears in the special prayers for fasting when there's a drought. So the Mishnah says as follows: on the first blessing, he says, "He who has answered Abraham at Mount Moriah should answer you and hearken to the voice of your cries this day." Now, what do you mean? I have to move down. Here it is. He who has answered Abraham. What do you mean who has answered Abraham? It must imply that Abraham raised his voice to God, and God responded to Abraham by saving Isaac. So this statement in our prayer service suggests that indeed there was a dialogue. It's not just a dialogue in Abraham's mind, because the satanic discussion here is taking place within Abraham. That's what it's about. It's raising the doubts that Abraham himself has, right? But here, there's actually what's alluded to is the possibility of a conversation that ensued between Abraham and God that yielded God's compassion, precisely what Khalil and the others accuse Abraham of not doing. Okay, interesting, very interesting. And finally, in the Midrashic presentation is my favorite. It appears earlier, but also brought again in the Yalkut, which is a later collection, and I only have it in Hebrew. I'm sorry, I should already have it translated. All right, but I'll translate for you. Vayikrai la malach Hashem min hashamayim, Abraham. So the angel of God appeals to Abraham from heaven to try to get Abraham, to stop. And he calls him Abraham. Mipnei shehaya Abraham maher l'shachto. Why did he call out Abraham twice? Because Abraham was rushing to fulfill the slaughter. He was so zealous and devoted that the angel had to call him twice to jar him because he wasn't listening. But listen, what the Midrash says. Amar lo Abraham. Abraham says to the angel, "Who are you?" Miata. Amar lo malach. I'm an angel. Oh, okay. Amar lo. Abraham says to the angel, Kishamar li HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'hakriv ba'atzmo amar li. Yesterday, when God commanded me to slaughter my son, it was God who did it. Who are you? Who are you? Now I demand that God tell me, and the miyad, right away, God says, Binishvati, etc., etc. Right. So what I love about this is going on in Abraham's mind. And this is the way in which Abraham expresses his doubt. What he's telling himself when the angel, what is he really saying to the angel? I don't really believe that this could be coming from God. Now that you've entered the picture, it really, I'm getting a clearer presentation that God most probably would never want me to do this. And that's exactly what happens, right? So this angel represents the reflections, the inner reflections of Abraham, who reaches a conclusion perhaps on his own that it would be impossible for God to have really commanded him to sacrifice his child. But that's what it says. So let's see how the commentaries pull this apart and answer and respond to this. So did God desire this sacrifice? So the first hint of some break in understanding this notion of God's command comes in a statement made by Nachmanides. Although I'm using Nachmanides, I don't know that he would agree with me. But there's an allusion here that I think is very helpful in terms of our understanding the next passage. Read with me the fourth line. Now you know who Nachmanides is. Nachmanides lived in the 13th century in the 13th century in Spain. He was the leading rabbi in Barcelona, in Catalonia, respected by Jews and Christians. He was forced into a debate with Pablo Cristiani in 1260. It was a debate that apparently he won, and he had to leave the country. That's what happens when you win those debates. And it was the beginning of the end for the Jews in Spain, in Christian Spain.
No.
And he was a mystic and a Talmudist and a halachist, the leading scholar of his generation, and a doctor, of course. And he differed greatly with Maimonides in numerous points because they came to Judaism, to religion, from different perspectives. One from a mystical perspective and the other from a rational perspective. And it's fascinating to see the way in which this plays out. One thing I would say to Nachmanides' credit, all his life he wrote with great respect for Maimonides, even though he differed with him, and the differences were sometimes were quite broad. Nevertheless, you get a sense of understanding of what it means to engage in a machloket l'shem shemayim, an argument for the sake of heaven. So Nachmanides says as follows. The concept expressed in this section of the Akedah, that it was God who was testing Avram. God is Elohim. I'm sorry, this translation is not precise. So it's Elohim who was testing Avram and commanding him regarding the binding of Isaac. And it was the angel of Yud-He Vav-He, God, who was preventing it and promising him that he'd be blessed. It'll be explained in my commentary, etc., although he doesn't go in the direction that we're going to go in. But I want you to see that as it's articulated already by a central voice in the medieval rabbinic tradition, that there's a distinction in the passage between the name of the God who commands and the name of the God who tells him, stop. The name of the God who affirms the act of slaughter and the name of the God who restrains and prevents and precludes the slaughter. and that has to do with characteristics that that I'll explain a little in a moment. That it seems to me lie at the heart of what it means to be an engaged Jew. So the central text, and it's a lot to read. I don't think we're going to read it all, and it's small. It appears in a philosophic work by Joseph ibn Kaspi. Now, it is relevant because Kaspi was a diehard Maimonidean. He lived in the 14th, 15th century. He was born in Arjan. His name Kaspi is Kesef, silver. And he came from a wealthy family. All his books, his many books and commentaries carry some sort of variation of Kesef. This Gevia Kesef is his philosophy work. Mitzaref Kesef is his commentary on the Torah, etc., etc. And he wrote a commentary on the entire Bible. And he wrote a commentary on Guide for the Perplexed. He is a card-carrying rationalist. I mean, in other words, he goes with Maimonides' rationalism beyond Maimonides. All right, so we'll see a bit of it here as it's presented, and at some point I'm going to summarize to you because I don't know that we want to read everything, but I want you to get a taste. We have actually, it's a classmate of mine wrote a dissertation on Ibn Kaspi. So I don't know if people can see what I'm presenting, but this is the Gevia Kesef with English, and the Hebrew is in the back. So we have the text, and many of the teachers. I mean, if you want to look up more in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, there's a long article about Ibn Kaspi, and I mean, you see other things online. It's worthwhile because he was an interesting personality. One more tidbit. He was so devoted, to the Maimonidean tradition that he traveled to Cairo to the Beit Midrash, to the Maimonidean Beit Midrash, only to be terribly disappointed because he found a group of Maimonides' descendants who all had become they were religious devotees, they were halachic, all of that, but they were practicing a form of Jewish Sufism that he didn't see as being consistent with the rational tradition that he had attributed to his mentor, to Maimonides, whom he so adored. I mean, there are other interesting things. He did write a very interesting. If you want some more information, you should read his will, his ethical will, because in his ethical will he describes a curriculum for his son. And I think that we all, if we're interested, we should be familiar with what a classical medieval Jewish curriculum was, and you'd be surprised of what a rabbi's curriculum would be. All right, so he writes as follows. While our patriarch Abraham was a man of God, he was not a fool who might confuse contingent statements with necessary ones, right? So this already is a lead-in. So he didn't confuse the command to sacrifice his son, which Ibn Kaspi thinks sees as a conditional statement, with a necessary one, with a one that is a correct and needs to be followed. So one must say that he did consider the possibility of what did in fact happen when the angel of the Lord called out to him out of the heaven. So he's one of those who reads the text and says that Abraham anticipated God's preventing the sacrifice, and he understood the command in its conditional form. Bring him there, but you don't have to kill him. But you don't have to kill him. That's not what I'm asking for. Reliable evidence that he considered this possibility is the fact that he said God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering. Had he been a fool and not foreseen that possibility, he would have hurried to slaughter his son, as did the fool, the king of Moab. So this is a reference to Misham Melech Moab, who practiced a form of Moloch worship. We think who in a warring situation where Moab was losing, allowed his son to be martyred so that they could be victorious. Now, this was practiced in the ancient. That was not uncommon in the ancient world, as was certain forms of child sacrifice. Although the evidence is that it wasn't as widespread as some scholars had suggested in the prior generation, and they didn't find that many children's bodies or in Carthage. I mean, there are arguments about that. Was there really a cult of child sacrifice? but it did exist. And clearly the prophets knew about it. Jeremiah knows about it. Gehinom. We have the valley right outside the walls of Jerusalem, which was supposedly the place where children were sacrificed. So we have some of that. So Misha, Melech Moab, is a biblical example of someone who was willing to sacrifice his child for the sake of the Moabite victory. All right. Then Ibn Kasbi continues in another section. He writes, "He who gave the Torah was furthermore careful in that the command to sacrifice Isaac is recorded as using only one name without repetition, while that means he called Abraham once only, while in preventing the sacrifice, the Torah records Abraham, Abraham, where the repetition is to inform us that the royal edict to desist was more insistent than the command to sacrifice had been." All right, so that's another reading. Why did the angel say Abraham, Abraham? Because the angel wanted to emphasize that this is the ikar, this is the essential command to observe, not the first one. The first one is now going to be eclipsed by the second commandment, which was desist. And to the second commandment, we call out Abraham, Abraham. It's more important. This allusion is intended for singular individuals. That means this allusion of understanding the significance that we're going to attribute here can only be understood by an elite, while for the masses, the repetition of the name is taken to allude to the fact that the sword was already placed in Isaac's neck, out of Abraham's urgent desire to slaughter him. So Ibn Kasbi is an elitist, and there is a troubling dimension to this, although it takes us out of our dilemma. The troubling dimension is that there are two religious spheres. There's the religious practice, the popular religious practice of the masses, who can't come to the sophisticated understanding, who are unlearned and don't have the capacity to embrace the higher knowledge, and they're the elite, who know the truth or who have access to the truth. The masses are benighted, and they have a form of religion that sometimes verges on superstition and all forms of and other types of popular devotion. So he says the illusion is intended for singular individuals, etc., etc. The knowledgeable individual, however, will benefit from the first and truthful exposition. There is another careful usage by God, who wrote the Torah. When commanding the sacrifice, God is mentioned, not the glorious name, which is the Tetragrammaton. So this is the Ramban's point. When commanding the sacrifice, Elohim is used. When commanding desist, Yud Hey Vav Hey is the Tetragrammaton. Accordingly, Abraham said, God will provide himself the lamb for a burnt offering, and it says, of which God had told him. Even subsequent to the order to desist, when speaking ex post facto, it is said, thou art a God-fearing man, instead of a man who fears the Lord, Yirei Elohim, and not a man who fears the Lord, Yirei Adonai. When desisting, however, it is written, the angel of Adonai, instead of the angel of Elohim. It also says, in the mount where Adonai is seen, Adonai Yireh. This is further explained elsewhere, where I explain the names of God. So this is fundamental, right? I want you to understand that, and this is something that we can pursue throughout the Bible. Ibn Kasbi is not a modern Bible scholar. He's not a biblical critic who suggests that there are different documents. However, he does say that different usages of God's name represent a different quality in our understanding of God. The Elohim quality is the quality, is the natural quality. It's the popular quality. It's the God that people confront in the world around them, and to whom they appeal in their traditional ways. And they think of that God as controlling all forms of nature, and they want to have access to that God so that God will do what they need in order for them to survive. And that's the nature of their religious life. The God Yud Hey Vav Hey is beyond all of this. The difference is in the names themselves as we understand them. Elohim comes from a root which means to judge. It's the distant natural God where Yud Hey Vav Hey comes from a root which is Hayah V'Yeh, which is a form of of God's presence. The Yud Hey Vav Hey is a contraction, the tetragrammaton of Hayah V'Yeh, was, is, will be. It means presence. It means relationship. It means I care. It means I'm here for you. So what Ibn Kaspi is saying is as follows. Abraham had to unlearn in order for him to be a successful transmitter of what Rambam calls data emet, the true religion. He had to be able to go beyond the norms of religious life of his time, where even the monotheists saw God in God's natural terms, the chief God of all of nature, and understand God as beyond the nature and the God with whom we have a personal relationship. And it's that, and when he gets to that understanding, he realizes that the God of relationship and the God who cares could never have commanded me to slaughter my son. My prior understanding was wrong, because I based my understanding on a misguided sense of the divine, a conditional relationship with the divine, not the true relationship to the divine. And it was Elohim who commanded me to offer. So let me interpret that. Abraham is giving voice, or Ibn Kaspi, to two religious impulses. There is the religious personality who says, what God requires is that I have to sacrifice everything for principles. Give up myself, give up my beloved, give up not only my possessions, but give up the people around me for the sake of God. Because it's the total submission. It's an extreme form of Leibovitchian devotion, right? Whereas when Abraham recognizes that that's not the God that I have been commissioned to transmit to the world. The aspect of God that I understand and that I relate to is a God who cares. And the God who cares could never want people to sacrifice everything for the sake of principle. In fact, that's a person that's a God who's willing to have people compromise on the religious demand for the sake of relationship, and understand that there's a priority in God's world. And the priority in God's world is love and not fear. And so Abraham was, in a way, if he emerged from this hole, the point is he emerged with an understanding that in order to be able to motivate people to devote themselves to God and to fulfill their lives in a productive way, they need a teaching of a God who's filled with love, rather than a God who's filled with demands, absolute demands. So the choice was presented, and as Ibn Kaspi would have it, you could read through the rest, the masses of people seem to think that sacrifice is the way of God. Ibn Kaspi is an extremist. He rejects the notion that God desires any sacrifice. He goes through the book of Genesis and he demonstrates that nowhere does God command to offer a sacrifice, and no sacrifice is offered for the sake of God. All sacrifices are offered by people voluntarily who offer to God because they imagine that's what God wants from them. And even the ram was not commanded. Abraham chose the ram to offer to God as a replacement. It was not a command. Ibn Kaspi says God does not desire brutality. God does not desire violence. Ibn Kaspi was a vegetarian. He wanted, and this is consistent with what I think we have to know in our minds today, he wanted humans to understand that they too are part of nature. God is our creator. We have the capacity as humans to have a relationship to God, right? So we have something extraordinary, but we also share in common with all of creation, including vegetation, including the inanimate. We're all part of that world, and we need to be able to respect that world, and we need to know who we are in that world, and God and our religious devotion cannot involve doing violence. We have to reduce the amount of violence that we perpetrate against the world. And he reads the Torah as a guidebook, not in total elimination of all forms of domination, but in gradual limitation of the abuse that we exact on the world around us. It's fascinating. He goes through the legislation regarding agriculture and regarding animals. And one after another, he says, this is in order to enhance our sense of being connected to them, of being related to them. You know, he says, Av echad mikulanu. We have one father. You know, we and the donkeys. I love it. I love it. You know, it also induces a sense of humility in terms of who we really are. Were we really given this world to abuse the world? So not only could God not have commanded Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, he doesn't want any sacrifices. Abraham's message to the world is to transcend the religious impulse that sees sacrifice as the highest form of commitment. The highest form of commitment is to be devoted to truth and to love. That's the highest form of commitment. The highest form of commitment is not to perform some grand performance which shows that I am the total believer. The greatest devotion most probably takes place inside the human being, who affirms the inner truth. But certainly in the pursuit of a moral life and a principled life. Now you can read more in Ibn Kaspi, as I said, on your own. Let me say that Rabbi Cook, I'll read the passage because here he differs totally from Leibovich. Rabbi Cook, the first chief rabbi of Palestine in the 20s, it is forbidden for religious behavior to compromise man's natural moral sensibility. If it does, then our Yirat Shamayim, our claim to be God-fearing, is no longer pure. An indication that it is pure is that our natural moral sense becomes more exalted as a consequence of religious inspiration. But if the opposite occurs, and the moral character of the individual or the collective is diminished by our religious observance, then we are certainly mistaken in our path. This type of supposed fear of heaven is pasul, right? It's wrong, it's defiled, it's polluted, okay? So the natural morality must be something that's enhanced, but we cannot reject natural morality, contra Leibovich. Most interesting is the Kotzker. So you see in Chassidut. Look what you have in Chassidut. It's thrilling to see the creativity in the Jewish exegetical interpretive tradition. The Kotzker writes as follows. Rabbi Menachem Mendel of Kotsk, one of the leading Hasidic rabbis in the 19th century. Horadat Yitzchak min ha'akedah hayta b'shvil Abraham Avinu nisayon kashe yoter meha'alato. The removal of Isaac from the altar of the Akedah was a greater test for Abraham than actually placing him on top of the altar, elevating him to the altar. All right, so that's what we're saying here. It was easy for Abraham to slaughter Isaac. All religions understood that sacrifice is of value. All popular religions saw that being willing to give up your son was a great act of returning God's present to the divine. Wow, Abraham is a believer. He can show it to the world. The true example of devotion is when confronted with the possibility of actually sacrificing his child and fulfilling this desire that all religious people have to give themselves up to God. Abraham withholds and Abraham restrains. That's the greatness of Abraham. That's wow. Right? That's B'zu Kavanat HaMidrash. That's the meaning of the Midrash. Afikte achite. You put him up, take him down. Now I know that you truly fear God. Now I know, because he took him off the altar. And this, I want you to have Rembrandt's picture in your mind, or any classical picture of the binding of Isaac. The knife is in his hand. He's ready to slaughter and bring it down. And at the last moment, he doesn't do it. So we have this whole story about angels and God. This is going on in Abraham. This is the way religion is being presented. Judaism is introducing a value, which is, it may be that obedience isn't all that it's cranked up to be, and that sometimes religion demands disobedience, and it demands that you be able to figure out, God could never want me to do something like that, because you have a moral compass, because you've internalized the natural morality, because you understand right, you distinguish between right from wrong. It's not open and available necessarily so easily. We need to train ourselves. I really have to appeal to you. Don't think of this, oh, well, natural morality, we can do whatever we want. No. There are demands of natural law, right? And how we internalize a virtuous life is not something that happens just like that. How do you regularize your behavior in such a way that you're practiced in being a moral human being, so that your response to different situations appeals, you know how to respond, because you have that worked out within you. We're all working on this. We're all working on this. That's why Abraham's demonstration in the Kutzker's mind is a grand demonstration to the world that although it appeared that Abraham was a knight of faith, as Kierkegaard calls him, ready to do the act, he showed greater faith when he restrained himself, and being perceived by a lot of religious people as being a failure. Right? It's the guy who didn't press the button, the suicide bomber who didn't press the button. That was Abraham at the Akedah. And right, so he's looked upon as a failure. He saved a lot of lives in the process, right? So and we have to, seriously confront that. Now, what's interesting is Samson Raphael Hirsch's comment. So Hirsch writes as follows. Hirsch is a German rabbi in the 19th century. He's struggling against reform. So he writes as follows from Frankfurt. But we stress the quite we stress this quite specially because one who calls himself a pathfinder of the science of Judaism, Abraham Geiger, who was a founder of Reform Judaism, in raving madness, has dared to raise his lying pen also against this, the very loftiest summit of spirituality reached, not only in Jewish, but in all events which show human greatness. So Hirsch sees the Akedah as an expression of human greatness. That's an example that the Torah shows to the world of how great the Jewish tradition is. So what violence does Geiger do to this? He turns this, as he does so many others, into its very opposite, and says that Abraham's greatness lay not in his being ready to obey the voice of his God, and sacrifice his son, but in his obeying the voice of the angel, telling him not to do so. And his real greatness lay in his coming to his senses in time and realizing that God finds no pleasure in human sacrifices. Just by this did Abraham become the greatest reformer of his time. And he was the first to abolish human sacrifices. So, this is the cynicism emerging from Hirsch's pen. He knew Geiger, they knew one another. And he was the first to abolish human sacrifice, substitute animal offerings for them. And then we naturally have surpassed the spirit of Abraham and proved ourselves to be on a still higher level, inasmuch as we have abolished sacrifices altogether, right? Us moderns. Only a twisted mind could possibly work this out of the story recorded here. All right, I have a few more minutes. I'm going to say something, and then maybe if people have any questions, let me take a couple of questions if there are any questions, and then I'll conclude. I'll make some comments about these poems.
And maybe you want to stop sharing so you can see people's faces.
Well, all right, okay, because I do want to make sure that I have this text. Oh, 1 second. What do I have to do? Okay, all right. Wait, I lost my screen completely. Wait, where am I? Wait, how do I get back on screen?
There might be a small.
Here I am.
Oh, you did it. Okay.
Okay. All right. So if anybody has a question, please. Okay.
So
Yes.
in the Midrash, at least, with regard to Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham argues that God needs to balance justice and compassion. That's kind of.
Yes, it's good. That's good. No, it's fine. Look. I think that's. I sort of read the personalities I pushed it all the way. I don't want to deny that, that Abraham had that impulse. You're right, because there's more than merely justice, because he keeps on negotiating with God. So it's not just there on a question of righteousness. He's going to go all the way and push God beyond what's just. I think that's good. That's very good. Anyone else? Okay. So what I want to say is that the story of the Akedah didn't end with Abraham. It didn't end with the Crusades in the Middle Ages. And it didn't end with the Holocaust. Modern Israeli literature is overwhelmingly represented in modern Israeli literature. The Akedah is overwhelmingly represented as a constant theme. And this is a theme that you should, in many ways, carry with you, because I remember this from Barbara Meyerhoff. Barbara Meyerhoff, Alaiha Shalom, was an anthropologist at USC, and she wrote a very important book called Number Our Days. It was based on our interviews at the Israel Evans Center what's the neighborhood there over there near the water, Santa Monica?
Venice.
In Venice, right, in Venice. It's in Italy, right, Venice. Anyway, so she devotes a chapter 3, to one character. His name is Shmuel. Shmuel is a contrarian. He doesn't live at the Levin Center. He comes there every day, right? And what he does is he upsets everybody. He gets into arguments with everybody. That's he's an East European character. So she was interviewing him at length about his hometown, about his early childhood. So he starts to tell her, and Shmuel, by the way, is a devoted socialist and secular Jew. She says, well, what do you recall from your childhood village? She said, I recall the synagogue. Well, what was so striking about the synagogue? He said there was a wall painting in the synagogue. And I think, do you know this, the world, that Polish synagogues were decorated. They were painted. The Israel Museum has a marvelous example of a synagogue, a painted synagogue. You can see it. There are books about it, and certainly with zodiacs, but beyond that, with biblical scenes throughout this. Not like our synagogues. Right? The walls were painted. The ceilings were painted. Right? Some of them, not all of them. So she said, well, what do you recall? We said, I recall there was a painting of the binding of Isaac. So Meyerhoff says, so Shmuel, what did it mean to you? I mean, Shmuel's a secular socialist. What does the painting of the binding of Isaac mean to a secular socialist? Let's understand. He said, and this is the pshat, and this is the meaning, the plain meaning. Fathers should no longer send their children to war. That's the meaning of the binding of Isaac. I mean, I tell you, I get emotional when I think about this. And if you read the Israeli poetry, then you see the swings from an early poem, a revisionist, Zionist, I would say violent celebrating, Greenberg, a prophet of rage, who says, if only he could be like Abraham, the father commanded to sacrifice his son. He would gladly do that. That to Chaim Guri, an early generation poet who talks about, if you see the last line on page, source 16, I don't have it on the screen, but the last line in his poem, Heritage, is, but he bequeathed that hour to his offspring. They are born with a knife in their hearts. It's the knife that they carry with them from the Holocaust into the modern state of Israel. And those of you who are fans of Amichai, so Amichai has numerous poems about the Akedah. And this is the one, I happen to like this one. It's not the most famous or important one, but it's a one about how every year Abraham would take his children on a visit to Mount Moriah and show them all the sights. Just like I take my children to the Negev. What do I show them in the Negev? This is where I fought in the war in 1956 in the Sinai War. This is what we fought in 1967, the 67 war. In other words, this is what the heritage of the Jews is, to carry on the tradition of bequeathing to their children the legacy of constantly being in battle. That's the burden that is transmitted. So much so that Hanoch Levine has enough. Hanoch Levine is I think he's still alive, a playwright, and sarcastic and vehement in his opposition. So his poem is, Father dear, when you stand over my grave, old and tired and forlorn here, and you see how they bury my body in the earth, and you stand over me, Father dear, don't stand then so proud, and don't lift up your head, Father dear. Abala, he's called. We're left flesh, facing flesh now, right? And this is the time to weep, Father dear. So let your eyes weep for my eyes, and don't be silent for my honor here. Something greater than honor now lies at your feet, Father dear. And don't say you've made a sacrifice. Not a sacrifice. Don't talk that way. Don't talk in holy terms. Don't make this a holy mission. For the one who sacrificed was me here. I'm the one, right? And don't say other high-flown words, for I am very low now, Father dear. Father dear, when you stand over my grave, old and tired and forlorn here, and you see how they bury my body in the earth, then you beg my pardon, Father dear. And Hanoch Levin has other, and some of them even more poignant dialogues. But I want to close on the appeal of a modern religious feminist who understands, an American who's been living in Israel for a long time, whose poem appears in a collection of women's teachings. There are now 2 volumes called Dirshuni. And one of the poems is Sarah Akedah, Sarah and the Akedah. And you see the capacity to take a critical perspective and reframe the Akedah in contemporary terms that in many ways is liberating, and certainly liberating for a more pronounced feminist critique and a feminist sensibility. So Rivka Lubitz writes as follows: Sarah and the Akedah. If you don't have it, I can share the screen again and get to it here. Let's go right here. Okay, it's the last poem. All right. Sometime after these matters, that's how it begins, Genesis 22. Matters, not the matters of Abraham, the matters pertain to Sarah. And God tested Sarah. The angel said to her, take your son, your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as an olah sacrifice, a total sacrifice. Sarah responded, no, for a mother will not slaughter her son. What are you talking about, God? Early in the morning, Sarah awakened and was shocked, for the boy was gone and so was his father. She spread her hands toward God in heaven and prayed, Ribono shel olam, I know that any person who slaughters his or her son in God's name will in the end have neither a son nor a God. No more truer words were spoken, right? That's the truth. That's not religious devotion, right? By doing so, you're executing your son and God. Please forgive Abraham for his mistake. That's an insight. That's a great insight. Please remember that the mother involved never contemplated slaughtering her son for God, and save the boy from his father. And please, God, save the boy from his father's hand. At that hour, Abraham reached for the knife to slaughter his son. The angel came forward and called to Abraham, do not send forth your hand, for now I know that you are God-fearing, even though you did not withhold your son. Okay? As a consequence, all that Sarah tells you, listen to her. Therefore, through Isaac, your offspring shall continue. Now, it will be fulfilled. One final word. When Magda Trachme died, she was the wife of Andre Trachme, the Protestant minister in Le Chambon, where the Protestant minister urged the inhabitants of Le Chambon to save the Jews. So the Jews were saved by these Provençal Huguenots who defied the Nazis, who were all over the town. And the preacher was the leader of the conspiracy. So when his wife died, there was an obituary in the New York Times. It happened to be on Shabbos, I remember it. So I read it that morning. And when I came to Hillel, I spoke about it because I was so moved. So they asked Magda, his wife, what gave your husband the strength and the disposition to be able to resist the Nazis in this way and defy them? And she said as follows. He grew up as a Protestant in Catholic France, as a minority. He understood from a young age that obedience isn't everything. In fact, that resistance and defiance is the way of God when you're asked to do something immoral. And it seems to me that's what we need to know, and that's what we need to teach. That's the grand nature of our religious tradition, that it's subversive, that it's willing to criticize itself in order to be able to emerge with a moral sensibility that allows us to continue our lives and to create. Tizku l'shanim rabot, merit many years, healthy years, right? Much love and peace. Shana tova to everyone. To be continued next week. See you next. Take care.
Did
Thank you so much.
Abraham fail or succeed the test?
Abraham, well, in the end, he succeeded because he didn't slaughter his son. Right? That has to be our standard in that regard. And he's rewarded. There are continued generations. Imagine what would have happened if he had gone ahead. Right? He has generations, and he has a community that continues, Abrahamic community.
Thank you.
Thank you. Shana
Thank you,
tova.
Chaim. Shana Tova.
Rabbi Chaim.
See you next week.
Teaching.
Daven well, wherever you choose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Shana
Tova.
Thank you. Thank you.
Shana Tova.
Okay.
Oh, hi, Perry. Shana Tova, Perry.
Shana Tova.
Good to see you. Marcia, I'm going to call you, Marcia.
Rabbi, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay. My name is Batsheva Feldman, and I just I have a comment and then I have a question, please.
Say that.
So the comment is, I post cooking videos that are called Bachi Cooks with Chutzpah, and yesterday I did a Zoom for a group of Jewish women for Rosh Chodesh.
Uh-huh.
So as I was sauteing the onions, I spoke to them about Rosh Hashanah, and I used what you shared with us last week about Rosh Hashanah and what Rabbi Lerner taught us 3 weeks earlier.
Okay.
They were glued to the screen.
Oh, wonderful.
They loved it. It was so profound. Even my husband said, where the heck do you come up with all these explanations?
Yeah.
And I said, it's Hillel, UCLA. That's where I get it from.
Thank you.
Now, I have a quick question also, if I may. If Abraham knew ahead of time that God will prevent him from proceeding with the Akedah, with the sacrifice, so why would God ask him?
He never knew, in other words, he knew, but he didn't know. In other words, you have to read this in the sense that he had an inkling. He hoped for. His sense of God was that God would redeem, but he didn't know for sure, because that's the point. There's an uncertainty, there's a drama built into this. That's why it took 3 days to get to the top. Why 3 days? To give you a sense that they had time to think about this. And by the time they got to the top of the mountain, he had rehearsed this time and time again, and nevertheless seemed to be ready to go ahead. So and he would have, if God wouldn't have stopped him. We have this picture not just of the angel crying out to him. Is it Rembrandt? I don't know which one of the painters has the angel holding back God's hand, Abraham's hand. Abraham's hand had to be restrained. If it wouldn't have been restrained, he would have gone forward. So it's not, the ambiguity is maintained, the uncertainty and indecision is maintained. There's a hope. There's a hope. The hope is expressed. Elohim Yireh Lo Haseh. That's how he expresses the hope. God will show us, right? God will show you. That's the way he says it, but he doesn't know. Now let me tell you something else about this. That's the difference between Judaism, the Jewish presentation, and the Islamic presentation. We take the story of Joseph. In Islam, Joseph knows in the beginning that it's all God's plan. So, and what he does is he submits to God's plan and lets all this stuff happen to him. The Torah presents the story filled with drama and uncertainty. You don't know how it's going to end. The brothers don't know how it's going to end. Joseph doesn't know how it's going to end. That's the degree, that's how the Torah is trying to instill within us a sense of development, a sense of change, a sense of transformation. It's not so simple what it means to be devoted to God. We're tempted to give everything up to God. That's a religious temptation. How do you overcome that temptation? Well, you have to read and study a story of a religious devotee who almost did it and stopped himself from doing it. The highest, Abraham. In other words, Judaism chooses to recognize our human impulses and allow them to be expressed, even if they can sometimes err. Even sometimes we make a mistake, but we'd rather go that way than predetermine and tell you from the beginning, don't worry, God knows how it's going to be, it'll all be okay. So we need to engage the world, and that's relevant for our contemporary lives, with a degree of uncertainty. We don't know. We don't know, and we don't know what's going to hit us all the time. And there are people, there are hucksters out there, con men, who are willing to tell you that they know the truth, they know what God wants, this is what you're supposed to do, there's no science. I mean, whatever declarative statements they make, they're out to completely, to wipe out all doubts. Jewish tradition rushes in or engages with and supports the human tendency to confront doubt in life and uncertainty. And we need that because the world is filled with uncertainty, and we don't know what's going to be dished out to us. All right, so Abraham didn't know. All right, that's a long answer to you. Okay, I have to go now actually. So I wish you a good yontif, everybody.
Thank you, Chaim.
Thank you.
Shana Tova, everyone. We'll see you online, okay?
Be well. We'll see you soon. Take care.
See you soon. Bye, Bachi.
Bachi, shalom, Bachi.
Bye, toda.